Hello and welcome to yesterday's airlines and another exclusive video showing off some of ngmodels' new mold samples. I want to start by thanking ngmodels for sending me this pair of Tupolev Tu-154 model samples. It's always a pleasure dealing with NG, and I'm really happy and pleased that they have confidence in me and my ability to take a look at these models and introduce them to yourselves, the collectors. So thanks very much, NG, for that. Also, as always, make sure that you like and subscribe to this channel and check me out on Instagram at YesterdayAirlines and at Facebook as well, because as well as the site yesterdaysairlines.com, I post a huge amount to those social media channels, different material on each often, and it's worthwhile checking those out and keeping an eye on those, because I get these kind of exclusives fairly regularly, and hopefully you find the information I provide useful. So good sources to keep up to date with what's going on in the 400 scale world. But anyway, back to the Tupolevs. Now, I think that probably nobody saw it coming when NG leaked that photo in January, which showed the 777s, the Tu-154s and the 747-8 mold sample, because none of those were molds which NG had really suggested that they were going to be working on, or, to be honest, that anyone had particularly asked for. So I have some mixed feelings about those choices by NG, because I would have personally preferred to see 747 Classics and an MD-80. But at the same time, of the three that they showed, the three different types, it is the Tu-154 which is the most interesting, because it is the most classic and I like classics, but also because, hey, look at it, it's a pretty cool looking aircraft. And also because in 400 scale, the 154 has got a reasonably flaky history of molds. Now, before we get into that though, we should talk a little about the 154 itself. So I will start by taking a walk through the variants, so give you a feeling for what the 154 looks like and what the two different versions that NG have provided here represent in relation to the real thing. And I should also point out that the primary source that anyone should be using for this kind of thing is really this wonderful book by Dmitry Komisarov, which is titled The Tupolev Tu-154 USSR's Medium Range Jetliner. And this is a wonderful book in the Aerofacts series. There are a selection of these books which cover major Russian types. And I highly recommend that you try and find these, because they're chock full of really cool information and images which cover off all the variants and the service history of the type they're looking at. And it's an excellent source of information about the 154 in this case, with huge amounts of detail. So it's a great place to go. And even though it's out of print, you can probably find a copy at aviation shows or secondhand bookstores and that kind of stuff. Okay, cool. Anyway, so I've been using that book. That's been helping me a lot with my analysis. But in terms of versions of the 154, obviously the aircraft itself, as you can clearly see from the samples, it's a tri-jet. When it came out, I think the Americans rather unfairly dubbed it the 727 ski, as historically, whenever the Soviets produced a new aircraft, the Americans immediately compared it to their own aircraft. It doesn't really look that much like his M27, except the general configuration. It's a larger aeroplane, I would say. It's a much more robust airframe. You can see it's got these really unusual triple bogey main gear for landing on rough fields, which are common in the Soviet Union, and gives the type a real ruggedness. And certainly the 154 has shown its ruggedness over the years. Yeah, it's been involved in quite a few crashes, but you wouldn't put that down to the aircraft itself. Typically, that's due to who's operating it and where it's operating, and conditions in Soviet countries or ex-Soviet countries are often much more primitive than those found in the West. Anyway, in terms of variants of the aircraft, in keeping with most Soviet era types, there are lots, but not all of them include major airframe modifications that you'd be able to see in a 400 scale model. Typically, the there are three kind of major body types for the 154, but only two are really particularly important, I would say. The original Tu-154, which has no A, B, C, D, or whatever, and it's typically called, I believe, the sans suffix, in the sense like it's got no suffix. That version had a much spikier HF aerial up on in front of the tail there. And those original 154s also had a different wing, because it became pretty clear once the original sans suffix version and the Tu-154A, which is a higher gross weight version, came out, that the original wing did not have the structural life and strength that it should have had, and it necessitated a complete wing redesign. And in fact, all those original Tu-154 sans suffix and A's were re-winged completely in the mid-70s, which leads to the primary version, or the primary initial version, should I say, which is the Tu-154B, and production began, I think, after about 120 or so units. But all those previous sans suffix and A's got the B wing, and they look broadly similar, except the A has a spikier HF aerial antenna. Because the B introduced a different kind of antenna. That is the Micron HF radio antenna. Micron HF radio antenna, and that necessitated a slightly chubbier spike forward of the tail. So that's introduced at that point in time. But otherwise, the broad airframe remains the same. The Tu-154B, the B1, and the B2. Those three versions all look similar from the outside. They all have the APU above the tail cone exhaust, and that tail cone exhaust from the side has a concave shape. They all have thrust reversers that are part of the engines on the side, but they are door type thrust reversers. And they all have a relatively clean wing, where only one of the flap track fairings, the outermost flap track fairing, crosses the rear margin boundary of the wing. So they is the Tu-154B, the B1 and the B2. The ultimate version of the 154 is actually the M version, and this introduced a variety of major changes, primarily because the 154 had never been particularly fuel efficient, and even in Soviet terms. And so they upgraded the engines. They put Soloviev D30 engines on the Tu-154M, replacing the old Kuznetsov NK8s. But these engines necessitated a bit of a redesign of the entire back end of the aircraft. And so the Tu-154M has a completely different airframe after the pressure dome. The Solovievs, being larger, required larger side engines, and these engines came with clamshell thrust reversers. It also necessitated a change in the number 2 engine intake, so that is a little larger, a little humpier than on the B version. And there was also a cleanup of the aerodynamics in general, which necessitated the moving the APU away, and that changed the back end of the aircraft. The tail cone is now not concave, it is a much simpler tail cone, and there is a fin fillet connecting the tail cone to the rudder. The back end looks a lot cleaner than on the earlier versions. There are also some other changes in the wings. The 154M gained a extra or a modified fuselage wing fairing, which has a kind of downturned beak look from the front, and it gives the wing a double kink rather than the single kink of the original Tu-154B wing. Also, the flap track fairings were extended, so all 5 pairs of flap track fairings now extend beyond the wing on the Tu-154M. So there's a series of relatively minor changes to the airframe, which nevertheless mean that it's pretty easy to tell when you've got a Tu-154M or a Tu-154B. Most of the time you look at the tail area, but you can also tell by looking at the wings as well. Okay, cool. Anyway, that's enough of that talk about the aircraft. Let's get into looking at these ngmodel mold samples and see how they compare. Okay, so I'll start with the Tu-154M, the most up-to-date version of the aircraft, and it'll become clear why I'm doing that in a little while. Now, the 154, as I said earlier, it's a pretty unique looking aircraft, even though it's got roughly the same layout to the 727. Certainly the wings are very different. The stowing of this triple bogey main gear is very unusual. And it's got this spiky HF antenna coming out of the front of the tail, which again gives it this quite unusual look. And it really doesn't look that much like a 727 at all. But I think, you know, if we take a look at the sample just overall, then I'm really liking the overall look and feel of the aircraft immediately here. I think that NG has captured, you know, the jizz of the 154 very nicely. But if we move into detail, there are a few things which I think could be modified and improved. And one of those kind of jumps out even when you're looking at this view. So we'll start with that. And that is the nose gear tire size. And so you can see here that it looks pretty much like the nose gear they're using here is almost the same size as the tires on the main gear, and that's not ideal. I think that it should definitely be smaller. In fact, I think that they could probably just actually use the same main gear tire which they've used on their TO204s. As you can see here, I think that would fit perfectly, not just because it's smaller, but also because the ratio of hub to rubber tire is actually better. The T154 had a tyre which is much more like this tyre on the 204, with a very wide hub and a very slim tyre, as opposed to this rather large, chunky nose gear tyre. So I think that's something which they can modify and should be a relatively simple change to make, and will improve the overall jizz look of the actual aircraft itself. Having said that, if we move up to the nose area and take a closer look at the actual nose, then I think that NG has captured this very nicely. So if we just kind of zoom in a bit here, then I think here that what you've got here is the classic 154 profile. It almost looks a little bit Concorde-like, but that's it's always had quite a pointy nose. But also, it's not just that. Around the cockpit is actually quite angular, and it comes here and it comes down quite steeply at the cockpit, and I think they've captured that really nicely. And the nose is pointed, but not too pointed. So again, I think that they've captured the shape of the nose cone and that cockpit region really nicely, and I haven't really got any complaints there. Decrease the size of that nose gear tyre, and I think that the front end of this aircraft is looking really nice. Now, there's quite a lot of detail also on the gear leg of the nose gear. So again, if I can get it to focus close in, you can see there's quite a lot of detail. That looks quite nice. I'm not entirely certain that the size of the nose gear door is quite correct. I think they maybe could make that slightly larger, so I'd probably recommend they take a bit of a look at that and see if they can improve that a little bit. But otherwise, I'd say the front of the aircraft is scoring really nicely. Now, moving on to the main gear, and as I said, the T154's got this really unusual triple bogey gear, which gives it good rough field performance. And you can see that there's a lot of good detailing going on here as well. I'm liking the main gear much more than I'm liking the nose gear. I do think maybe the main gear doors are a little bit small. They are very small on a T154 anyway, but perhaps could be a little bit larger. And the gear leg that's coming up here at the front does dogleg slightly back into the wing there when it shouldn't. So they could probably just slightly change the profile there as well. But otherwise, I'm really liking the main gear. I think that's looking really very nice. Now, obviously, you've got these huge fairings that come off the back of the wing here, which is where the gear retracts into, and they look really nice as well. I can't say too much nice about those. They've got this nice slab-sided profile. Even though they're quite curved, they're also quite flat-sided, which is very accurate for the type, in my opinion, and looks really good. And overall, if you look at the wing, the 154's got quite this unique and unusual wing profile, and it's looking very good with these big gear pods, but also these rather obvious boundary layer fences on the wing top as well. And this is a 154M, so if I look at the wing, then I can see that they've worked hard to get the profile right here. So you've got a straight line up to about here, and then the angle changes, and then the angle changes again here to join the fuselage, which is diagnostic of the M version. Also, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 flap track fairings beyond the rear margin. So this is an accurate wing for the Tu-154M. In fact, it's probably the best M version wing that's ever been produced, because the other molds typically don't have an M version wing. I think the Diecastcollector version does, but you can almost ignore that mold completely. So it's a really good wing. It shows the 154M very nicely. It's got the diagnostic features, the fin fillet here changing the angle, and also the extra flap track, or the lengthened flap track fairings. And if you look underneath, then similarly you've got nice detail. And of course, also you can see here that you have some really good fine etched imprinting for the flaps and the ailerons as well on both sides of the wing, which look really very nice. Okay, so moving towards the rear of the aircraft, which for the M is the bit that most people probably will look at. And you can see here they've got a very interesting and nicely produced back end. I think that they've done a good job overall here, though once again I'm not entirely fully convinced by it. But most of the features of the M here are shown nicely. I do like these side engines. They are noticeably bigger than on the other mould, the B version mould, where the engines are smaller. These are chunkier and larger, as they should be for the Soloviev. They've got some good fan detailing, which is hard to see on the video. See if I can zoom in. Some good fan detailing inside the engine. Very hard to get this to focus on that. But also, they've got the clamshell thrust reversers here as well. And it's not just the engines themselves, but also they've got a unique pylon here, which looks good and fits the shape of the pylon. It's different to the pylon on the B version. So that's looking good as well. The vertical stabilizer here is very nicely shaped. There's some really good detailing on the rudder. You can see the hinge joints, they look really good. And the shape and size of the HF aerial spike here is pleasing, as well as are the T-tail horizontal stabs. They're looking very nice as well. And if you come back down the rudder, then you get the fillet. There's no APU visible, and you've got the simplified back end of the 154M here. So this mold is looking really good at the back from those angles. However, the one thing that I'm not 100% sure about is the actual number 2 intake itself. Now, when I look at the two molds, then this appears to be the same for both, and I don't think it should be. The Soloviev's a larger engine, and when you look at images, it is slightly humped here, and it's not really showing on this version of the mold. So I think that they perhaps need to expand and increase the size of the number 2 engine slightly and change the shape subtly to take into account the Soloviev engines. So for the M version, I think that is the big takeaway for me, is that they perhaps need to modify the top of the number 2 engine intake there to take into account the modified profile the Soloviev gives. Otherwise, overall, I haven't got any major issues with the mould here, except, obviously, as we discussed, the size of the nose gear tyre. So, broadly, I think that they've done a good job here with the M version of the mould. I'll just put her up onto the stand because unlike the 737, she does have a stand hole. And you've got a very nice looking Tu-154M. The first, I'd say, accurate Tu-154M in 400 scale, and easily, I'd say also, the best Tu-154 that's been made in this scale to date. Okay, so that is the M version of the Tu-154. Typically the M's, as they are newer, lasted longer in service. Most of the later aircraft, the more modern ones, were M's, certainly the majority which were flying with Aeroflot up to 2010 and flying in various ex-Eastern Bloc militaries, flying in Iran. Also, many of the export customers were using this version as well. So the M is pretty popular. I think it'll take up a good chunk of the releases that NG make. And so it's probably the most important of the two from that perspective. Having said that, you can't really be producing 154s by ignoring the first half of the production run, which is what the B models account for. So what we do now is move over and have a look at the Tu-154B. Okay, so here is the Tu-154B, or B1 or B2. They all look the same externally. Mould, and obviously it shares many of the same characters and features as the M, since the aircraft are very, very similar. So from the front end, the nose, the cockpit, most of the fuselage are the same. It's got the same issue with the nose gear size. That needs to be reduced, but I think that should be a relatively easy job to do. It's obviously also got the same main gear. Now, one of the problems that this mould has is it's also, unfortunately, got the same wing, which it shouldn't have. So if I move the B sample up here, then you can see that it actually has the same wing as the M sample I was looking at a minute ago. So whereas here it's got the change of angle here, it's also got the second change of angle, which it should not have. That should just continue on and join the fuselage here. And the fairing join at the front here should be rounder, should not have this slightly downturned element on it, because that is, again, a feature of the M and not the B. So that's a problem. Also, they've got the extended flapjack fairings of the M, because this is just the M wing. It should be the case that only this one here, the outermost flapjack fairing, reaches beyond the margin on a B. So NG here have put the M wing on their B version, which is a shame. Rather ironically, all the other molds have done the opposite and have put the B version wing on their M's. So that's a bit funny. So that's not accurate, and I think they do need to change that. Moving towards the rear of the aircraft, however, and you can see that they have worked a lot harder here on getting the correct profile for a B version Tu-154. We've got the smaller and curvier Kuznetsov side engines here. These have got some nice fan detailing on as well. It's not painted black, so you'll be able to see it more easily than on the M version of the model. If I can get the camera to focus. There we go. So you can see you've got the fan blades internal there to those side engines. So that's all looking very good. And if we move the aircraft around again, then we have the diagnostic B version back end of the aircraft here. So the top of the tail is obviously the same, the horizontal stabilizers are the same, but you can see when we follow the rudder down here that these older versions have this rather unusual APU here coming out above the number 2 engine exhaust. And also the number 2 engine exhaust has this rather unusual concave shape from the side and gives a very different look to that of the 154M. So if we just compare the two side by side, you can see the difference in profile. And as you move around, you can see that they definitely streamlined and tidied up the M version. You can also see that the back of those side engines is very different on the B version of the aircraft. Then you've got a no clamshell thrust reversers. You've got this more traditional exhaust. The thrust reversers that are door thrust reversers, they will no doubt be printed on. You've also got a different profile to the actual engine pylons themselves, which come out behind the engines, unlike on the M version here. So they worked hard on the engines. I'm really liking these. I'm really liking the exhaust. That's looking really good. And I think that the curve here of the engine, the number 2 engine at the top there, is more fitting to the B version as well. So I think that looks okay for a B, whereas I think that perhaps this one needs to be increased in size somewhat to be an M. It's one of those. It's either this one needs to be decreased or this one needs to be increased, and I think this one is fine. So I'd go with the M being slightly changed the profile. I'm not 100% the profile is correct at the top here, but it's certainly better and more fitting of the B version of the aircraft. So overall, I think that the B version, you know, looks really good, except that you've got the issues with the fact it's using the wing of the M. So that's something which hopefully NG will be able to resolve. They are quite large mods, I guess, to put a different wing on this, which is, I guess, one of the reasons why nobody else ever bothered projecting the M version of the wing. But need to shorten those flap jack fairings and modify the profile of the fuselage join there to give that a slightly different look, to get an accurate B version. But considering that all of the existing Tu-154s, even when their M's have the B wing, then I guess it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And overall, I think it's reasonably clear that this Tu-154, from most of the perspectives, certainly the nose and the detailing around the HF spike and the engines and the wings, it looks a lot nicer and looks better than what I'm seeing on my other Tu-154s, which it probably should, because this is a 2022 mould as opposed to one made in 2002. So that's a quick look at the 2 Tu-154 moulds that ngmodels have sent me, both the M and the B versions, but obviously they need to do a bit of work on that wing to get it accurate for the B, and I do think they probably need to do a bit of work on the top of the M's number 2 nacelle as well. The other major issue is the nose gear tyre size, which should be relatively easy to fix, and maybe some minor tweaks around the size of the gear doors and that forward process leg on the main gear. But broadly, I'm reasonably happy with these. I think they've got less issues than the 777s had recently, and I think they'll make some very nice Tu-154s. I've already spoken to NG, and they obviously are going to take into account the criticisms of the review, so hope to see some modifications of these samples before they go into production. It'll be really interesting to see, you know, what NG chooses to do and chooses to make with these Tu-154s. I can't say I've been overwhelmed with joy at some of the choices they've been making recently, but perhaps I'm alone in that. I'd like to see, personally, a really nice range of Tu-154s dating from its service history, from the 70s up through to the 2010s. I'd especially like to see some Iranian examples, actually, but it'll be interesting to see. I get the feeling that NG will almost certainly produce an Air Koryu, because the Chinese just love North Korea, and I imagine there'll also be some of the later military versions, Polish Air Force perhaps, that kind of thing. But it'll be great to see some interesting and unusual Tu-154s as well as the more obvious. There are still a variety of relatively obvious 154s to be made for European flag carriers, and certainly a lot of the old Aeroclassics releases are hard to come by anyway. So there's plenty of scope for 154 releases, I think, and it will be interesting to see how NG fits the type into its release schedule now that it's got so many different molds to use. But anyway, that'll be something for us to see in the coming months. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope you look forward to seeing these 154s as much as I'm going to. And yeah, thank you very much for watching, and thank you once again, NG, for sending the mold samples. Okay guys, until next time, that's it for this video. I'll see you later.